The Shmup collection consists of 3 really quite different shmups from developers Astroport and is being brought to the Switch by Pixelnest, who kindly supplied me with my review copy. The 3 games in question are Wolfflame, ARM7DX and Cetasius Next. I've already put out more detailed reviews of each individual title, which you can find elsewhere on my channel, and the purpose of this video is simply to give a brief summary of each game, followed by my thoughts on the collection as a whole. We'll start with Wolfflame, the only vert of our triumvirate, and arguably the weakest link here. Wolfflame does do a solid job getting the fundamentals of an early 90s shmup down right, but its alternation between slow and easy to dodge bullet patterns and lightning fast rifle shots causes a little too much frustration. Presentation wise, it's the only one not to benefit from a DX upgrade, and it shows. Nothing awful or off-putting about the visuals, but nor is there much flair. Overall, it's a competent if unspectacular effort, and I gave it a 7 out of 10. ARM7DX was next up, and this one, despite being unashamedly stripped back and maybe even basic, was my favourite of the bunch. Putting you in command of a badass armoured mech, ARM7 has a real frantic, relentless momentum to its gameplay, and the visuals, while lacking detail or polish, conjure up an atmosphere perfectly suited to shmups of this ilk. Its various weapon setup options give it a good amount of replayability despite its short and sweet nature, and I gave it an 8 out of 10. Cetasius Next rounded things out with a more complex and measured approach, more akin to games like R-Type, Gradius, or for a more modern comparison, Super Hydra. While it doesn't quite attain the high levels of any of those titles, it does more than enough to hold its own. Sudden frustrating passages and puzzly moments that for me wreck the pace the game builds up so well in its better sections brought the game down in my personal estimation, but there's no doubt it's another perfectly solid addition, and I gave it another 8 out of 10. Now the more mathematically inclined among you may have been able to take those 3 numbers in your head and work out that a 7 and 2/8 ought to average out at a 7.5 or 8 overall, and be thinking job done. But, and it's a little difficult for me to explain my reasoning here even to myself, I don't score the Shmup collection a 7.5 or an 8, I scored an 8.5. Now, in Scotland we have a phrase, and please excuse the incoming bad language, that perfectly encapsulates what you're probably thinking right now. Ya fucking what? Which roughly translates as, what? In trying to explain to myself why I think this way, I had to consider what I consider scores to mean, and how I decide on them. Which was kind of interesting because, in general, I don't think a numerical score is a terribly good way of expressing an opinion about a game, and I do hope most people use the content of these reviews to judge the games, rather than a somewhat arbitrary number dropped at the end. Anyway, what I discovered was that when choosing these numbers, I tend to think of them as how much I would recommend a particular game or collection to other people who, in effect, I don't know. The individual eShop titles already reviewed, I would recommend with a strength of 7, 8 and 8 out of 10, obviously. But this collection, despite being made up purely of said eShop titles, and with no real frills or extras beyond a simple menu, strikes me as being something very few shmup fans would have complaints about picking up. None of these games have got any better by virtue of being on this collection, but at the same time, while I could understand anyone wanting to only pick up one of them and skip another on an individual basis, I think this collection is a far harder pass. These 3 games are all very, very fun, and the Shmup collection really ought to offer any fan of older shmups some serious satisfaction. Honestly, I'm still not sure any of that makes sense, but whatever. I highly recommend the Shmup collection to you, especially if you're a collector, as it comes in a relatively inexpensive physical edition too. Do let me know your thoughts if you play any or all of these, and I'll hopefully see you next time. Cheers.